No, lo mismo, si es pequeño. Pues muchas gracias a todos por venir y gracias a la gente de Alfa por traernos a Marc. Espero que hayáis disfrutado su libro, o no, espero que no hayáis disfrutado nada, que le hayáis pasado mal. Y ahora tengo unas palabras, Marc, y pues ya de las preguntas que queráis. ¿Vale?
Fantastic.
Okay, do you want to answer to this? Okay. We are going to have a little introduction of this, and then the core of this meeting is your question, your feelings about the book, and whatever you want to ask him for your chronicles, I understand, no? For your blogs. And, well, we are very happy to have Marc here. We have been waiting during a year to to have the book and to have it here. And today we met a very funny and good person. I'm very happy to meet him. So no, that's because you read the book, and me was thinking that it would be a little, I don't know how to say it, but difficult to deal with a person that can write this. But we are very happy to see that it is not the case. Even because we were talking about that today, and I would like Marc to say that, and this is my first question, then you can start. We were talking today about that this book, The House of Leaf, others, is, many people think that it's only or mainly a terror book, a book of terror, but it is not the case. It's not my case neither. Every reader can find something different in this book, and this is because this is the reader experience, the most important, isn't it? And so I would like him to explain to you what he thinks about what this book is, and then we can go forward with your question, please.
Hello, everyone. My sincerest apologies first that I cannot answer these questions in Spanish. So thank you for your civility to handle these questions in English. I feel it would be a little egregious if I were to talk about what House of Leaves is. It's a book that I started writing 25 years ago. It came out 15 years ago, roughly. And now has a life of its own and carries out many private conversations with readers that I'm not close to privy to. And in many ways I feel like the parent of a child that's gone on to do very interesting things. And I can speak on behalf of that child, but it's like a parent who speaks too much about a child. Eventually you sort of say, hey, I'm going to go talk to my friend over there. I'm not going to deal with what this guy says. So I can only report what other people have told me about how terrified they are, or how they cried during it, or how much it meant to them. And I think something we were discussing a little earlier, I did have one story that was special to me. I was at an art gallery, and an older gentleman came up to me and he said, "Are you Marc Danielewski?" I said, "I am." "Did you write House of Leaves?" I said, "I did." He said, "I want to thank you." He extended his hand. I shook his hand. "Of course, I haven't read your book." Of course. And then he proceeded to tell me how his daughter had tried to kill herself and he was at the hospital when she woke up, and he said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she said, "Will you get me House of Leaves?" Now, you know as much as I do now about what that means. You know, in one sense, it's an honor. In one sense, it's a mystery. In one sense, I'm proud of my book. In another sense, I'm kind of melancholy because I realize that my book is growing up, and I'm no longer part of that book's life at all. It's participating with other people, with cultural elements on its own, and I can sort of distantly admire it, and at the same time kind of feel a proud loss at its maturity. How was that?
¿Habéis entendido?
Yeah.
¿No? Me imagino. Bueno.
We need scorecards, you can hold them up. 4. So, questions?
Adelante.
When I was reading the book, I couldn't help to think of Borges and of the Babel Library and of the Aleph. Did you have Borges in mind when you were writing this?
Well, the book attempts to be transparent in all of its influences. It's part of its exercise is to list every single thing that could have potentially influenced it. So the book, among other things, is a compendium of its own origins. But put simply, you know, Spanish literature has played an enormous part. I mean, we could start with Cervantes. You know, this was something that was my father discussed. Eventually, I read. Of course, Borges is throughout. I'm fortunate to have wonderful conversations now with contemporary novelists, 2 of whom live in Los Angeles, Amy Bender and Sarah Bynum, and the discussion of Borges' big heart, because a lot of times people feel that Borges is very cold. It's a cerebral exercise, and yet Amy and Sarah and I both agree that there's great affect to those kind of stories. Of course, Cortázar is there. Of course, you know many poets, Paz and Neruda, and I mean there's a long list. And in some ways, even though I only started reading Bolaño later, I kind of feel like he's almost a predecessor in some ways. And you know, I have to add that I don't know. There's something also melancholy about coming to Barcelona and knowing that he's not here. It would have been nice, even if I never met him, to know that he you know, that kind of furnace was at work, you know, north of Barcelona. It would have been a pleasure. But instead, his ghost is here, and I feel he wanders around and tells me to avoid that place and that place, because that's where the tourists go. And check out that place. It's the dirtiest place, but you will find a good drink and maybe a good word.
I was wondering, because the book came out 15 years ago, no less, the audience has changed a lot. I mean, now there's a lot of transmedia thing going. We are used to looking up for Easter eggs, and I think the new TV series, Third Hollywood Phase, all those things, I don't know, found footage, and so this is a thing that we are now very used to looking for. So I think maybe the audience has changed for people like us who receive the translation now, and people my age, for instance, that were not used before to that. Do you think the audience is looking for more clues now than they were before, maybe?
It's a great question, and again, I mean, my ability to track what the book is doing now is no better than yours. And in some ways, I wish I could ask the same question of you, because I'm curious how it's doing. And you know, we can get into this later if you want, but from a personal point of view, where I am on a literary level is a very different place than I was 15 years ago. And certainly when I was writing House of Leaves, the technology for found footage like that wasn't really available. You know, it was, people did have video cameras, but it wasn't like everyone had an easy way to record something on their phone. You know, the Easter eggs, as you referred to, were part of literature. It's always been part of music, even. You know, Bach inscribing his own name in pieces, and so, you know, that was certainly part of it. But then the whole notion of reality TV hadn't occurred yet. So a lot of what was happening in House of Leaves was still before that explosion that was enabled by technology, by the media, by networks, and by sort of new social media platforms. One of the things, though, that I have noticed is that people may be drawn in a little by the puzzles, by the connectivity, but in general, there seems to be kind of a collective experience that takes place with a book that is somehow in between all of that. So it's not just the puzzle, or just this connectivity, or just this ambiguity, but somehow that these things, like a fusion reactor, kind of magnetically hold an experience that sort of floats independent of everything. So consequently, you have people that want to parse every single puzzle, and then you have other people who can, I mean, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds that I met who are reading it and are moved by it. They're scared by it. They find it romantic. You know, there are all of these kind of experiences that take place, and that's kind of the way I sort of refers back to the way I was talking about this book in the first place, is that it's carrying on now relationships that are very kind of independent of anything that I could have predicted, you know, all those years ago.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
In more than one level in the novel, the impulse to create something ends up cannibalizing both lives and the personality of the artist, of the creator. What's your experience writing it like that?
That it cannibalized me?
Sort of. It was
The characters or the book?
the characters in the book, but you as an author, it was an obsessive thing to write such a book. It was very involving.
I like that question. I mean, every book for me that I write is a trial, and every book has had an enormous cost. I've never had that luxury of writing a book that was already ripe and just needed to be plucked, like Virginia Woolf once described, I guess, an ethereal novel that I'll never be able to write. So, you know, Only Revolutions for me was like climbing Everest without oxygen. House of Leaves was climbing Everest with oxygen, but maybe no shoes. So there was a sense of just, you know, an awful price, and it's so I feel changed by that experience, and I certainly by all the experiences, and somewhat, I guess, diminished. I mean, I think in many ways, as I can look at my books and say, oh, that's mine, I also feel that I'm ever less present or important to those books. And so it's not really so much a cannibalization, because it doesn't come back on me. It's more of just a amputation. Any others? That's it?
I do have a question. It's kind of, I don't mean to make it offensive or insulting.
Oh no, please, go ahead.
It's just, I had the feeling when I started reading the book, when I found the very first phrase at the very beginning, there was a game state going on. You're going to enter this is not for you. Okay, cool. However, at the very first, I was very, very, very angry at Johnny Trump's intermissions. He started appearing in the book. But then later on, as you started getting into the book, you start realizing that Johnny's is the only part that matters.
Mm-hmm.
The only part that might be actually true,
Mm-hmm.
even though he starts saying from the very beginning he's an unreliable narrator,
Mm-hmm.
and that we always make histories to keep our peace of mind.
Right.
So, to what extent is the House of Leaves an infinite joke by Johnny towards all of us?
Well, that's a good reading, and considering how the limited time that the book's been out in Spanish, I commend you. I think you are perhaps approaching the Great Hall, but you haven't quite gotten to the Great Staircase. Yes, Johnny matters, but there are other voices that matter therein. And I think, you know, a joke shoots for a laugh. A joke shoots for sort of a momentary explosion of emotion. But there's more at stake than just a joke, I think, in House of Leaves. And I think, you know, you know, for a long time it was, you know, I was accused of sort of being this experimental writer that was, you know, into gimmicks. And gimmick kind of has a one little bit, like, oh, he's the guy that puts letters on the page in a different way, right? Right. No, I know you're not saying that. I'm diverging a little, and I was being intentionally oblique that it is an important discovery that you're making about Johnny Truant's voice, but there are other voices there, and how those voices work together is really more significant. And I think you're on the right track when you're looking for what is kind of real beyond the meta real. If there is kind of a meta real, then there's a real even beyond that. But I think, you know, one of the things that's become important to me is and it's the thing that's most viscerally uncomfortable to most people, is simply the layout, the way the books are designed. Now, House of Leaves has just come out, and in essence, what it does is it remediates a movie. It takes one form of media and puts it into another, right? It's looking through the lens of the novel at the film. Only Revolutions is looking through the lens of the novel at music. And The 50-Year Sword is looking through the lens of the novel at the oral tale, at the campfire story. And The Familiar, which I'm at work on now, which is a 27-volume novel about a girl who finds a kitten, is a remediation, or it's looking through the lens of the novel at the television series. Now, well, that's interesting, but what's the point? Well, part of it is the way that is to observe how image is taking more and more prominence in our world. And one of the reasons for this is that it's easily accessible. We are all literate when it comes in some ways to image. And Gaston Bachelard talks about sort of our innate ability to process image. But it's primitive in a way, because it doesn't follow in lockstep to any sort of analysis or any understanding of kind of the burden of image. It's just easily accessible. And at the same time, you know, you can look at text, which is about speech, which is about language, which is about music, and this is a different form, and now it's kind of become codified as normal text. You know, we look at it, we understand the pathway of the page. We're easily mollified by its shape, and we say, okay, well, now we can kind of get into these waters. So what I do isn't exactly a graphic novel. It's not a movie. It's not a picture book. But at the same time, it's not purely textual. So people for a while were saying, well, is it postmodern, or is it deconstruction, or is it this? Is it just those sort of? And again, I'm kind of circling back to your question, because postmodernism is very much about the joke. It's about the laughter. You know, Pynchon's gravity's rainbows. Is sort of, we will keep our buoyant voices above the distending parabola of death above us, as the V2 collapses in on us, as the apocalypse collapses in on us. And so I started to see more and more, okay, this isn't postmodern, it goes beyond postmodern, it keeps moving into a territory that I haven't quite seen seen sort of formally addressed in critical theory. And finally, I realized it was my responsibility to come up with a term, which I have recently, especially as I've been dealing with the familiar. And that is a word that I coined called signaconic. Okay, and it's very simple. It's sign, S-I-G-N, and icon, but I pronounce it signaconic. And what it is it addresses that which is the pictorial, that which is the image, and that which is the sign, which is the text. But instead of moving towards one direction, which will just take up massive sort of synaptic nets devoted only to image, or those like more modest nets but incredibly powerful processing territories in your mind that deal with language, it goes in between. So the idea is through text, and this is what you can see in all my books, is through text that is signaconic. It verges on image and it verges on pure language. By attempting to apprehend both, you kind of can free yourself of both, and therefore perceive the world in a way that's not dominated by either. Because let's face it, the world out there is not an image. That image is just simply present because of our little retinal screens that are processing, the frequencies of light that we can perceive. And at the same time, if we apply words to it, that's not the world out there. That's a mauling kind of quantum foam out there that's rendering something that we can address. But in order for us to move more gracefully through the world, we need to be able to apprehend it in a way that's not entirely human. These are the faculties that have been given to us that define us as human. And so this course that I'm on, this exploration, is saying, let's wrest away a little away from the importance of language and from the importance of image, and therefore more clearly apprehend the world that is beyond us. Ha 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 ha.
Do you know the graphic novels by Chris Ware?
Of course, yes.
Everything you were saying was just thinking of him.
And exactly, because Chris Ware starts with image. So you expect, I can rely on simply that part of me that experiences movies or whatnot. But he's so literate in the way that he creates his stories, building stories and whatnot, that you then start to realize, like, oh, I need to access more parts of my mind, that these things need to ignite to process it. Yeah. Chris Ware, phenomenal.
Also, working with the book as an object, so that it's not only the text, but what you said, the signaconic. It's like it's not only what it's saying, but how it says, even graphically, even the image. So in this graphic novel by Chris Ware, is in the latest one, which is now also published here in Spain, the one of the girl without the leg. I can remember that name.
Yeah.
It's doing also this thing, changing the drawing according to what he's explaining, even the colors. And I was just thinking of it, so I wanted to make sure you knew it. Because
Yeah, he's published actually by my publisher in the U.S. So it's one of those, there can be these lovely little advantages as someone says, "Have you seen Chris Ware's book?" And I'm like, "Oh wow, look at this." We had a very profound meeting. I'm trying to remember. I think it was in Minneapolis. He was there at a table signing, and I was at a table signing. I said, "Hi, Chris." He looked at me and said, "Hi, Mark." And then he went back to signing, and I went back to signing. Great ideas were exchanged. But we were sort of like the two idiot parents, I think. We were like, "Yeah, cool. Your kids are doing amazing. Yeah, my kids, it's cool,
I arrived a bit late, so I'm sorry if this has been always asked. But if I
Nothing has been asked, and nothing has been answered.
That's good for me. If I'm correct, writing The House of Leaves took a span of 10 years maybe. So I would like to know how you managed to keep consistent with the idea that you start writing and your idea about the book when you end writing. How you manage to keep some consistency on what do you believe the the House of Leaves book became when it was already written, and how it became, how it ended. I'm not
Well,
sure.
the end is, another thing that I've wrestled with, but it kind of sits patiently and correctly in my mind, is that a novel is finished when it consumes its point of origin. It's a line, I wrote it, but it's true. So that impulse that you think that's important, that gets you going, you know the book is done when it has devoured that impulse, where it is no longer, it no longer matters where it started. It has become its own thing. The origin, however, is more complicated because, talking about cannibal, right? It's the book itself has devoured its own beginning. Its own, its own causation is, in a way, it is obscured by what it finally becomes because it no longer matters where it comes. It's its own thing, and its origins then become more tenuous because it becomes its own creature, I guess. But the beginning of the book is I can only describe more faithfully is an impulse. It doesn't arrive as I'm going to write a story about this, or I'm going to tell it in this way, because that is kind of a gimmick. It's kind of I'm going to tell a story about this guy that walks into a bar, and then it's a joke, right? That's the same thing. It's like I'm going to tell you a story about a house that's bigger on the inside, and then I'm just going to throw all this stuff in. For me, it began just with this sense that I had something that needed to be beyond me. It was a darkness inside of me that had to be a shadow beyond me. It was a shadow cast by darkness. It was something that was inarticulate, without light, without voice, and I wouldn't even necessarily say it was a book. That was the means for me to approach the demands of this feeling. If I were a gifted musician, perhaps it would come out in notes. If I worked with marble, perhaps it would be that way. If I was a politician, perhaps it would be a force that would drive me to sort of communicate with others. But it was substantial in the sense that it drove me at every moment, at every turn while I was making a living, whether I was working up at an inn, cutting wood, or building paths through a wood, or working at a bar, or I was an apprentice for a plumber, or all these kind of things throughout. There was this constant desire to write something, and those things came out in a way that were pictorial. They came out as sort of philosophical analysis. They came out as poems. They came out as sketches of sort of the flaneur, the sort of in the tradition of whether it was Kerouac or Bukowski or Fante, which is where you can sort of see the origins of a character like Johnny Truant, but certainly even further back to the likes of Stephen Dedalus and Ulysses. It depends where you want to focus, but those origins are clearly there. To sort of the modern American, family drama, whether you want to look at Updike or you want to look at, the realists like Roth or whatnot. And it was just kind of this big mess that just kept going. And I guess at a certain point, a different author might have said, well, I'm going to focus just on this. But that was where I guess I was in line with my times, and I suddenly said, you know what, I'm going to keep it all. I don't know how, but I've got to hold it. It's important. This stuff matters. The writing outside of the lines, turning the text upside down, the things that your teacher told you not to do, this matters to me, and I'm going to keep holding on to it. So slowly the backpack of my true belongings were getting left behind me in ways that I could survive as I kept holding on to these sort of sheaves of material, these journals and whatnot. And then it was about 1993 actually, and likely there's a psychological impulse, or a causality, I should say, in the fact that my father died then. When I had this idea of a house that was a little bit bigger on the inside than the outside. So this is, depending on how you date it, it could be anywhere from, it could be 3 to 5 years after I've been writing. And at first I thought, okay, well, this is either a poem, or it's a short story, or maybe it's another bit of philosophy, or maybe it's just a gag. And I sat with it for a few months, and then I did have that eureka moment of like, oh, wait a minute. The family lives inside this house. Oh, wait a minute. This young guy, he finds the story of the family living in this house. Oh, wait a minute. all this stuff that I've been writing about, like about cinematic grammar and how you could actually use appropriate techniques in film and use it in a book. Wait a minute, I could apply that. And then all of this stuff, I mean, it wasn't everything, but a great deal of it was suddenly unified with this narrative. And then it was pretty much a straight shot for 7 years.
Another question that I have is, well, I really love the book because it plays a lot with typography, for example, and composition. That's one of the main reasons that it attracted me. And I'm curious about how do you think these kind of books, and House of Leaves, as an example, can do well, or how can they be translated? So how they can make the switch to the digital publishing era. They are quite complicated to be adapted as an electronic books. So how do you see that as something that it will happen in the future? And I'm sure a lot of publishers, even if they publish on paper, they also are interested in finally publishing in a digital way.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Well, early on, I remember I was talking to another American author, Rick Moody, about what I saw as the coming age of the ebook, and he said, "Not a chance. Not a chance. I'll bet you $100, you know, it doesn't get any footing." And I said, "Done." And then I saw him a couple years later, and he's like, "Yeah, I owe you $100." It just took off. But then something curious happened. Now this is present day. It's kind of plateaued, you know. I mean, publishers are now investing in warehouses because they've seen that the electronic media has actually flattened out for some reason, and that people are still turning to books. Now, there are a lot of really smart people involved in looking at these numbers, and they care about those numbers because it's about making a living, it's about keeping their company afloat. And they're not seeing the trend move the way MP3s moved, the way digital music moved. You know, there's still something about the format of the book. Part of it is that the platform for books hasn't stabilized. You know, personal anecdote, I write in all my books. And so, you know, the Moby Dick that I buy at a store, that I then write, that I mark up, it becomes my Moby Dick. So if I'm working on something, I can turn to that book and I can see where I underlined, et cetera, et cetera. You can do that with certain applications, but as I have done, sort of as an experiment, only to discover that something happened in the whatever, you know, as it was migrating back to my computer, and all of it's gone. So the book itself is incredibly stable, and in some ways you could say I'm conservative in that regard, because I recognize that this form is far more trustworthy than any form that's currently out there. It can sustain a lot of battering, and it still allows a great deal of motion beyond its borders. You know, I mean, it's, you know, some people are up in arms about the idea that pages can be turned or minimal type can be put on the page, because, you know, they think, well, I thought of that, I could do that, you just did it, you got lucky or something like that. But we've all known that the codex itself can expand and can use, you know, its own geometries, its own proportions. I think that the other thing that books offer is a place that's uninterrupted. You know, one of the great promises of these oracles of iPads and Kindles and whatnot is that they are sort of, that they can do other things as well. You can play music on them, you can get your emails, etc. But once as you corrupted it in a way, then you're like, oh, I could get on there, I could start reading, you know, Savage Detectives, but then I could get a bill, or I'll be distracted by something else. I mean, one of the things that's so great about a book still is that it gives you this privacy. You know, it gathers you into its folds, literally. I mean, it even has a set of puns that are built into its shape. And it's there that you can collude with something that's much more intimate, that's not at risk of being interrupted by a power failure, you know, a sudden jarring of the flash drive, you know. There's so many other things that sort of tell you, you know, this is temporary, you know. And that in itself may create, by the way, its own fiction. It's not to say, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with that, but it may be that that the books that come out of, that are purely designed for the digital format have to be horror books in them, of their own, because they're painting a world that is so transient. It's a place for haikus and the fear of instability. You know, that would be a perfect, you know, political upheaval. That's the novel that should be written for the iPad. At the same time, you know, it's a very early form, so it may ultimately stabilize. It may create something that is more sturdy than the book. But as we see, the book is there and it's still standing. And you know, I'm, you know, for the record here, I love the prospects of it. You know, we turned the 50-year sword into an electronic book with all sorts of textual animations and music. We're working now on Only Revolutions to present it in a different way. House of Leaves eventually. I mean, it is something that has to happen. But it's also so time-consuming to conceive that I also imagine that there could be a career for people. That literally you would be an e-book director, and you would come in. You were literate. You were textually experienced, and you would say, "This is the kind of this is what I can do to your book," you know, and that's exciting. Yeah.
Another one.
Okay, I have I came from the world of scientific writing, so I'm very used to work with lots of references. And other things that I read in the parts of Zampanov, okay, I find it very, very interesting. I enjoy it very much because they are a lot of well documented. But I became a bit frustrated also, as other people have commented here, because maybe it's not important for the author, but from the point of view of fans, we tend to like very much some consistency, even if it's the fantasy world the author is writing. But so I found it very frustrating that even the great deal of reference that Zampanov collects about the film, it seems that it doesn't exist because there's no real reference. The other guy, it finds no reference at all. People who's mentioned it in the Zampanov bibliography doesn't recognize having seen the experiment, and that really frustrated me a lot because it's not very real to happen if that movie really existed, and I see it's just something that happens in that fantasy world. But I found that inconsistent.
Suddenly
it's my 5 cents.
It's become a very personal meeting, of course.
Yeah.
Because we do have to ask about your frustration. What was it exactly that you wanted? You wanted to be assured that it was true, that there was a reference?
I found it strange that if the experiment were true, it really were no reference at all. It seems to be some kind of Zampanov's invention.
Right.
But then...
Oh, see, now we're starting to approach
Yeah,
something there.
then...
The friend to the left of you is approaching it from one angle, now you're approaching it from another, so this is good.
Yeah, I mean, the other things that I think is maybe it's an invention.
I don't agree with you. I mean, I think it's one of the start points of the book. Everything in this book is doubtful. I mean, we're talking about a book about a film that does not exist, written by a blind man who couldn't see the film even if it existed, and found by a junkie. So having all these references, which, and some of them they do exist. He refers to Rainer Maria Rilke, for example.
Yes.
Mixing real references with false references increases this doubt atmosphere, which makes you feel like nothing is quite sure. Like you don't really have a clue.
Yes, I can understand that. But the amount of reference, and they are very well constructed. That's what I mean. I've seen a lot of reference in publishing, and they are very well constructed. All the references that refer to people who have seen or has published something, or magazines that have published some reviews about the experiment, and found that nothing is real in that fantasy universe of Zampanov.
Just a quick time out here, just briefly. wonderfully illustrated too, and I think one of the things I do have to point out here is the extraordinary production of this book. I mean, the kind of conversations that are already starting here could not have happened if it weren't translated and reproduced as well as it was. I mean, even the artifacts in the back page have been translated. You know, that they were actually, you know, somehow, I don't know. I mean, it's more than just Photoshop. You know, some handwriting had to be done. I mean, to get these pieces here. I mean, like, these are all in Spanish. No one did that. They didn't do it in France. They didn't do it in Germany. I mean, these were luscious versions of this book, and here you can see just how fastidious everything is. I mean, just even the point of the footnotes or whatnot. But there's also a great deal of subtlety, and this is why I do have to commend the translator, Xavi, I've learned his name is called, but Javier Calvo. And, you know, as you were pointing out, of course, it's written by a blind man. What does that mean? Well, a lot of the footnotes in English, right, begin with see, you know, the poetics of space, or see this, or see that. And then we look at this footnote here, 212, and it's vers la poétique de l'espace. So even, you know, Xavi was paying attention to that particular verb. He could have said check out, or, you know, but he was keeping to the whole vocabulary of seeing and perceiving. I mean, I will chime in here with a personal note. It's not going to resolve this particular debate, but one of the things that I have detested are those novels that have emerged out of I shouldn't even call them novels, dignified, but this sort of fad for the memoir in the U.S. You know, this is true. This is based on a true story. You know, without this, it would be true. You know, blah 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 blah. You know, I think, you know, one of the things that House of Leaves does, and it is in this sense in the tradition of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Pullman and Donaldson and Martin, is that it tells you from the start it's a fantasy. It tells you it's not true, and then it tells you that that's okay, because what matters, what happens, the alchemical reaction that is going to take place is just as significant, and is more significant. And it goes beyond that, because this is where you're going to hear me as being sort of an older man talking about sort of the morality of literature. But the fact is that what this book demands you to do is to imagine. These books are not for people without imaginations. You know, all of my books, and they get more difficult. Only Revolutions is much harder. It creates, it demands, you know, a great deal of imagining on the part of the reader. And in House of Leaves, the reader has to imagine, the reader has to illuminate those dark rooms, those dark hallways. They're impossible to film, right? They actually would destroy the darkness. You would see a corner or whatnot. So how do you imagine that darkness? That's the challenge that's put before the reader. And I personally feel that the imagination is a muscle, in essence. I mean, it's an inept metaphor, but it is something that can be nurtured and strengthened. Now, you tell me, how can we have any empathy for another person if we can't imagine? How can we look at another and see how their life is, and see how the travails are different from ours, and then imagine that, you know, and then feel for that? We cannot if we cannot imagine that. So if we are not constantly practicing our imagination, we are destroying our ability for empathy, and we are destroying our ability to stay civilized. You know, right here, fiction, literature, it is a moral component of any society.
I wanted to ask about the translation process, because while I was reading, I was thinking that sometimes there are some typos. Johnny points out to a few, but for a translation, or well, translator or proofreader, it has to be very, very frustrating. And I was thinking, if do you get kind of emails or something? There was some dialogue. You had notes for translation, or there was I don't know, a way to translate that was universal, or each translator contacted you or something?
There was a choice that I made early on that I couldn't oversee step by step the translation of each book. It would take up too much time, and I would never be able to write another thing. I think the advantage that a translator has is, especially nowadays, is that there's just a wealth of material out there. You can go to the forums, you can go, you can read, academic, papers, and you can sort of value the perceived errors, I suppose, and see how they would face and how they can be, how they can be utilized and how they can be interpreted. I think, one of the things is that it kind of, translating my book is kind of a self-regulating system. They're long, they're difficult. So only someone who's really wants a challenge, who's a poet in his or her own, his or her own being, will address a book like this. And so every act of translation is an act of poetic interpretation, if you will. So the translators generally have been very powerful artists in their own right, and therefore not only handle the intentional infelicities, but also may create their own new Easter eggs, their own new deployments of possibilities within the text, because they've so understood it. So, as identical as this book is to the U.S. version, I can pretty much assure you that there's also some Spanish magic that's at work there.
You said before that this book was not really postmodern, but rather hyper-modern, that's good to say. But then you've got mostly all the typical stuff of postmodernism. There is the joke, and the characters, they are typical lost characters in search of themselves, especially Johnny, but also the whole of the family. Even Tom, even the brother, is lost in his own way. And the house is also a metaphor of this getting lost. You get lost inside the house, and it's completely dark. So, do you really think it's not a postmodern book?
I just want to clarify. I would say that my work is signicomic. So I'm referring to this was something that I wrote, like I said, it came out 15 years ago. So when I look at sort of where I'm continually interested, if I now look at Only Revolutions, which almost has none of what you're saying, and then further on to the 50-Year Sword and the Familiar, then it becomes a different tack. I would call this very much a journeyman's piece. It definitely, its roots are in the postmodern deconstructive soil, But then I think it becomes something else, because as much as we're talking about this is just a joke or this is relative, there is something that is defined by these different viewpoints. So one can easily say, well, Johnny thinks this, so he's unreliable. Zampano thinks this, so he's unreliable. Pelafina, well, she thinks this, and who is she anyway, and so she's unreliable. Therefore, nothing at all is captured except loss and darkness and whatnot. But that's really not the experience that's in the book. I think I could say that with some authority because of just the way I've interacted with readers. Now, I like to say readers other than fans. I think fans is a little derogatory. So that there is an experience that does emerge out of that darkness in the end. And that's not typically postmodern, that there is this kind of a condensation of meaning that comes outside of its various narrative perspectives. So one of the things that I did vie against, for instance, and this is also very postmodern, despite what it protests to be, is the monolithic voice. We become familiar with a voice and we enjoy that voice, and there's no reason not to, But you read Hemingway, you read Bolaño, you read, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you read Vonnegut, you read Virginia Woolf. They all have a certain rhythm and a certain way that they approach a story. And what's wonderful about that kind of storytelling is that in all its elaborations, it organizes the world in a way that's sensible. So I can sort of say, oh, I want to see what he thinks of the world and how he's going to paint this picture, or I want to see what she's doing and how what kind of acoustics she maps out in her story. House of Leaves is different in this regard because it doesn't have that monolithic voice. It doesn't have one voice, and in some ways that's the loneliness, and that's the part that harkens back to sort of the amputation that I was sort of referring to, is that I can never look at any of my books and go, well, that's my voice. That feels comfortable. Like, oh, I'm reflected there. I don't feel like I'm living in my book. I feel like the books are living. But Johnny's voice is very different from Zampano's, very different from the editors, very different from Pelafina's, And the same thing happens with Sam and Haley in Only Revolutions, or the 5 anonymous narrators, And that, to me, reflects a more honest way of perceiving, apprehending the world, is that there are these multiple sounds. There are multiple organizing melodies that function at large, and they create a cacophony. And in one sense, conservative Puritans would be sort of like, oh, it's just nothing but noise, it's din. But as you listen to it and you begin to parse it, you're like, oh, that is the music of the world. We hear birds, we hear trains, we hear someone talking about this in this speech, we see it in this way. And how those things are put together, that's what interests me.
A simple question. Why the blue for the word of house? And why the red for the Minotaur Demon? Is it an arbitrary decision, or there are...
Do you really think it's an arbitrary decision?
I think that no.
I mean, no, I'm curious. Do you really think it's arbitrary?
I think that no.
Yeah.
I think that no. But maybe it's only an arbitrary decision, aesthetic decision. Or...
I can't answer that question directly. I will tell you it's not arbitrary at all. I would encourage you, if you want, to look at the tradition of what text has appeared in red, for example. I mean, there are very specific examples. There are very long-lasting examples. The question of why blue, one has to turn a little to the arts. You have to look at sort of the punning nature of what Magritte was doing, or what does it mean if you have a blue house? What if the house is in a blueprint? What exactly is that conjuring? What kind of, even looking at Banksy, and kind of the image puns that are going on. So there are meanings that are reflected in that. Not to mention, since it's about a movie, what would it mean that there is something that's blue, and how would that then affect the relationship to the whole text? So that's how I would answer it. Like I said, no questions, no answers.
Okay, one question. Is the book completely 100% knowledgeable for a reader? Can we get to the 100% of it? I mean, is there any possibility for a reader to feel like I know everything of the House of Leaves? Is there any way that we can do that?
Are you in love?
Yeah.
How long have you been in love?
For some years.
How many years?
Like about 7.
7. And is that enough?
No.
Do you think you will ever know that love?
No, I guess not.
So can we say that about any book?
Yeah, but this book is special about that. I mean, there's a lot of secrets, of hidden passages, of stuff that I will probably not know about in my life. And we'll always look back to the book and say, well, I don't know.
But isn't there a point also when you're with your lover and you solve the riddles, you solve the little mysteries, and only at that point are you delivered to the great riddles and the great mysteries, which will elude you forever.
Yeah, I guess so.
That would be my answer. It's unsatisfying the way love is, but maybe satisfying too in the way love is.
Well, I guess that's what you expected for the readers, to be unsatisfied but also attracted to it.
I think that's a good point. I certainly think it's probably only relevant to writers or artists out there that I couldn't write this book with an expectation. Like that idea that I would have any energy to sort of spend thinking about how the book would be received, that is, I can categorically say is not true. It just, when you work for 10 years and you see the times change and you say people are telling you that no one will ever be able to read it and it'll never be published and all of that, and you're spending so much effort working on consistency, you know, dealing with the anxiety of your postmodern forefathers and working constantly until you're kind of, like I said, immersed in the book itself, so that it no longer contains an origin of itself. It becomes its own thing. You know, for me, Johnny Truant is a living, breathing being. So is Pelafina. So is Zampano. When all of those things are taking place, you can't say, well, I hope this reader takes it this way or takes it that way. How will I ever know what that girl who's emerging from her state after trying to take her life was thinking when she said, I want to read that book? What's her expectation? To be frustrated, you know, to be kind of satisfied? I think that would be impolite for anyone in this room, including myself, to sort of assume. But there was something there that spoke to that place. And again, that's beyond me. So any expectation really of how the book would be received and packaged, I'm not in advertising, I'm in literature.
But there was some moment while writing the book in which you thought that it would be impossible to find someone who published it, because it's not a conventional book. Was it difficult to find?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It took a while to find an agent, then the agent took the book out to 40 publishers, and one publisher said, okay, maybe. It does have a little, it has an interesting digital story, and I suppose in some ways I have to recognize that this has always been part of my work, because even later on in Only Revolutions, I solicited readers, people on the forum, people in other places to supply, like, you know, their favorite car, their favorite plant, their favorite animal, personal history, you know, these kind of little moments. The 50-Year Sword included some stuff. The Familiar has grown now. It's kind of this atelier. It has like 12 artists that are working on it, about half a dozen translators. But back then, what I had done before I'd found even an agent is I put House of Leaves up online, and it was a PDF. And it was funny because it took almost all night to output the PDF. It was back in the, you couldn't just go save as PDF. It was just like, it just kept churning and churning, and we thought the computer crashed, and then we'd restart it, and finally we said, well, let's just let it churn all night. So we let it churn all night, and then come morning, there it was, you know, just this little PDF icon. But based on that, and then I printed up these little business cards, and I put the web address, and had / tildes, all sorts of nastiness, very difficult to punch in. But readers did find their way there, and it wasn't a lot, but it was a wide array of people. So there was a cop in the Southland, there was some older woman, there was a young kid, none of whom I ever met, but that just kind of said, oh, this is really cool, wow, you know. So when we were talking to the publisher at the time thought maybe people who were grad students, you know, in their 20s, that was the only group of people that were going to be able to read it. They figured the book was unreadable, like on some level. They were excited by it. I mean, they published Chris Ware, so they're interested in what's, you know, what's kind of on the edge, I suppose. But when I was able to say, hey, look at the variety of people that are reading it now online, that was enough for them to say, okay, let's go a little wider with it in that sense. But, you know, doubt is always there. Doubt informs ambiguity, but it's also through doubt that we hold on to one moment of certainty.
My question was more if it was difficult to find a publisher.
Oh yeah, it was 40, we got one, and then even that was a trial because they thought it was ready to go. I said, oh, no, the Labyrinth chapter hasn't even been typeset, so I had to go there. I was actually living at Pantheon, you know, getting there at like 5, 6 in the morning, working until late at night, struggling with different kind of softwares to make it work because nothing was able. I mean, it's funny because I really thought those days were behind me, and you know, even now I don't know if anyone's going to publish The Familiar. I mean, my publisher has bought 10 of the books, you know, and they've paid me, and I've been working nonstop. But in itself, it's already become something that's exceeding the technology. That's another problem with the digital form, is it has a hard time handling really what I'm doing. So I just gave my publisher volume 1 of The Familiar. And I'm sorry, I'm assuming a certain amount here. The Familiar is a 27-volume novel about a 12-year-old girl that finds a kitten. And I look at each 5 volumes as being a season. And so my publisher, in essence, has signed on for 2 seasons. And I've written 10, I've sort of plotted and written a lot of the 27, and now I went back to sort of rewriting and finishing volume 1. So as I was finishing volume 1, this is just a few weeks ago, I mean, I break out in a cold sweat thinking about it. My computer, which is the latest computer, and it has an enormous amount of RAM, kept crashing. The InDesign suite failed numerous times. Outputting the PDF took a long time. I sat there waiting, watched it crash, you know, hoped that the file wasn't corrupted, was making, and suddenly I'm back again to these days of House of Leads, and I'm like, what's going on? So the PDF that was outputted, and this is just for my publisher to read, this is unprintable. Like it doesn't have the resolution that you would need to go to the presses. It's a quarter of a gig big. So we're there on the edge again, you know, but that's what's fun. You know, technology has to follow what we're doing. There's nothing more, you know, wild and, you know, and not of metal than what your mind is capable of doing.
You will be a programmer, so.
Be a programmer. Yeah. No, I have too much respect for programmers, but I know a few to call now, actually.
If it compared with, well, your book has been compared with Moby Dick, with Ulysses, with many really great books. How do you feel about it?
I don't have time to feel about that. You know, I think maybe there was a luxury I afforded myself when the book first came out, but it's you know, life's short. You know, I think about all that Roberto Bolaño didn't finish. You know, and I think of the volumes that I have ahead of me, and you know, so for me, it's really thinking about the details of the work and what's possible and how much of it I can get through. I was a little nervous though. I mean, she seems so nice, right, and sort of quiet and timid. But I was talking about how, well, maybe I won't even get a few volumes in on The Familiar. You know, it'll be like Fellini's 8.5. It'll be the gesture towards something that was never quite completed. It was the effort. And Claudia looked at me. I think we could find someone else to finish writing it. In Spain, we will bring it to a conclusion. You know, we're used to people dying off. We finished the project eventually.
It's used to happen. It happens with a lot of people. Yeah, I was thinking about that.
We are in Gigamesh. They are the publishers of Martin in Spain.
Yeah, I know.
So they are a bit afraid of that.
I mean, that's a very interesting thing. It seems likely that the series will complete before the books are finished. And that's sort of interesting because, weirdly enough, everyone's worried about that, but you see, it gives George Martin the upper hand. Because you see, if he finishes book 6, right, and then the series holds true to book 6, he's already told Benioff and Weiss how it ends. So then they go on and they provide the very ending to Game of Thrones, right? He can have the last word. He can change the ending.
Yeah.
And that would kind of be a cool literary experience, right? You've read all the books, you then watch the HBO, you kind of know what's going to happen, but you still want to see what he did, and then all of a sudden it's different. At least you know how I do it. Thank you very much. What am I doing? Am I signing?